49. That is the number a man finally settled on, sitting across from detectives in a county jail when they asked him how many women he had killed. 49 that they could prove, but the number he carried in his own head was higher. He told investigators plainly, almost apologetically, that he had killed so many that he could no longer keep them straight. He could not match faces to places. He could not remember which body went to which patch of woods. The dead had blurred together into a quantity, and the man who had reduced them to that quantity sat in a chair in an ordinary jumpsuit and tried, and failed, to count. His name was Gary Leon Ridgway. For nearly 2 decades before anyone knew that name, the killings around Seattle were attributed to a phantom. An offender no one had seen, no one could describe, identified only by the place his earliest victims were found. The Green River Killer. He was not caught by a stakeout. He was not caught by a confession that cracked under pressure in an interrogation room. He was caught in 2001 by a machine, by a method, by science finally growing capable of reading a sample he had handed over voluntarily 14 years earlier. The answer to the most expensive serial murder hunt in American history had been sitting in an evidence freezer, unreadable, for almost a decade and a half. Sit with that for a moment. The truth was already in police custody. They simply did not yet have the tools to see it. But before any of that, before the truck painter, and the freezer, and the 49, there were the women themselves, and they have to come first, because the entire structure of this case was built on the premise that they would not. They were overwhelmingly young. Many of them were teenagers. Many were sex workers, runaways, girls who had drifted to the highway because home had failed them or because nowhere else would have them. They lived and worked along the Pacific Highway's South Strip, the long commercial corridor that ran past the airport south of Seattle, a place of motels and gas stations and parking lots, a place where people came and went and no one wrote down their names. To the man hunting them, that anonymity was the whole point. He chose women he believed the system would not prioritize. He chose them precisely because he had calculated, coldly and correctly, that when they vanished, the machinery of justice would move slowly, if it moved at all. For years, he was right. And that is the grave thesis at the center of this story. This was not, in the end, a mystery that could not be solved. It was a mystery that was not solved because of who the victims were. They were daughters. They were children. Several of them were too young to legally drive the cars they were picked up in. They had mothers waiting by phones that never rang, and fathers who drove the strip themselves at night, looking long after the official searching had quietly stopped. They were not a category of person. They were people. And before we name the man who killed them, we are going to name them. It began to surface in the summer of 1982. In the span of just a few weeks, across July and August, 5 bodies were discovered in or near the Green River in King County, Washington. They came in a cluster, close together in time and in place, and that clustering was what announced to the public that something organized and methodical was happening. A single death along that corridor might be absorbed quietly into the statistics of a hard part of the world. 5, found near the same water in the same short stretch of summer, could not be. The river gave the case its name, the name it would carry for almost 20 years, the name that would appear on task force letterhead and newspaper front pages long after most people stopped believing it would ever be attached to a face. The first of them to be recovered was a girl named Wendy Coffield. She was 16 years old. Her body was found in the Green River on the 15th of July, 1982. Say that again slowly, because it is the part that the long machinery of the case so often forgot. She was 16, a child, not a statistic, not a lead, not an entry in a file. A 16-year-old whose life ended in the water of a county river and whose death marks the documented beginning of the recovered series. Everything that comes after, the forensics, the task force, the consultations, the technology, the staggering final number, all of it has to be understood as orbiting around her and around the others found with her in those weeks. Deborah Bonner, Marcia Chapman, Cynthia Hines, Opal Mills. Names that belong to real people. Names that, for a long time, the public learned only as a count. The killer used the river and he used the woods. He dumped his victims at remote tree-shrouded sites scattered across the county, and he returned. That is the detail investigators would only fully understand much later. He went back to the places he had left them. He created clusters, groupings of remains in specific locations, and that geographic patterning would eventually become a kind of signature, a way of reading his behavior backward across the map. The horror here is not in any embellishment. The horror is in the method itself, stated plainly. A man who treated the disposal of human beings as a logistical problem, who selected terrain the way a careful person selects anything, for efficiency and for the low odds of being seen. And the terrain he hunted was the Strip itself, Pacific Highway South, the SeaTac corridor, where an ordinary-looking man in an ordinary pickup truck could pull to the curb and no one would think twice. He understood, better than anyone investigating him, what made that corridor his hunting ground. It was transient by nature. People moved through it and people disappeared from it, and the disappearances did not always generate alarm. A young woman who was there on a Tuesday and gone by Thursday might be assumed to have moved on, drifted to another city, gone home, gone anywhere. The corridor did not keep careful track of its own, and the man who worked it knew that. He approached women he believed he could lure with the offer of money, women whose absences he calculated would draw the least urgency, the fewest questions, the slowest response. He killed them, and he disposed of them with what he later described, in flat and terrible language, as minimal risk of detection. He revisited the sites where he left them. He was, in his own reckoning, careful. And the corridor, underwatched and underserved, rewarded his care. What protected him most was not the darkness or the woods or the river. It was his ordinariness. He was a working man. He had a job, a steady one. He had a home, and at various points a wife, a church, a routine. He drove a truck because he was the kind of man who drove a truck. There was nothing in his face, his manner, his life, that signaled what he was. That ordinariness was not a disguise he put on. It was simply who he appeared to be. And it functioned as the most effective camouflage imaginable, because the imagination of the public, and too often the investigation, wanted the monster to look like a monster. It wanted a wild-eyed stranger, an obvious predator. It did not want a polite man in a pickup who blended into the morning commute. And so the man in the pickup moved through the corridor and through the years, hiding in the open, indistinguishable from every other ordinary man on Pacific Highway South. For a long stretch of that time, the official understanding of the case was simply that an unknown predator was at large and could not be caught. That was the accepted account, stated and restated. A man without a name, without a face, somewhere out there, uncatchable. The killings, which had announced themselves so violently in the summer of 1982, did not continue at that pace forever. By the middle of the decade, the frequency seemed to slow, and when a pattern of killing slows, the people watching it begin to construct explanations. Perhaps the offender had died. Perhaps he had been arrested for something else entirely and was sitting in a prison cell in another state, his identity never connected to the river. Perhaps he had simply stopped. There was, beneath those explanations, a quieter and more dangerous assumption, the hope that the problem might have resolved itself, that the killer had been removed from circulation by some force other than the investigation, and that the work of catching him might, in effect, no longer be necessary. That assumption is one of the things this story has to interrogate, because it allowed attention to drift away from a man who was, in fact, still alive, still working, still living his ordinary life along the same roads. And it was not for lack of resources. The investigation that grew up around these murders became one of the largest and most expensive serial murder investigations in American history to that point. It had a name of its own, the task force, and it had personnel, files, money, hours, an apparatus built specifically to find one man. Tens of thousands of pages accumulated, names of suspects accumulated. Tips came in by the thousand and were logged and chased and filed. The scale of the effort was genuinely enormous, and that scale is part of what makes the eventual story so hard to absorb, Because the honest framing is this: scale is not the same as success. You can pour years and dollars and people into a problem and still not solve it. The task force was big. For nearly 2 decades, it was not, by the only measure that mattered, effective. It could not convert what it had into a case that named a defendant and put him in a courtroom. The leads went in. The conviction did not come out. The desperation of that long stalemate produced one of the most unsettling documented details in the entire history of American crime investigation. In the middle of the 1980s, with the corridor still claiming women and the task force unable to close the distance to a name, investigators took an extraordinary step. They went to a prison cell. They sat down with a convicted killer, a man already condemned for a string of murders of young women, a man awaiting execution, and they asked him for help. They consulted him for insight into the mind of the offender they were hunting. One of the investigators central to the analytic side of the case carried that consultation forward, treating the imprisoned murderer as a kind of dark consultant, a man who might understand the psychology of the river killer because he shared something of his architecture. It is a real detail, and it is a profoundly disturbing one. One murderer profiled from his cell to generate clues toward another. It should not be presented as spectacle, because it was not spectacle to the people who did it. It was a measure of how far they had run out of conventional options. When investigators sit across a table from a man they helped condemn and ask him to think like the killer they cannot catch, that is not a story about cleverness. It is a story about the institution reaching the end of what it knew how to do, and reaching anyway, because the women along Pacific Highway South kept disappearing and someone had to try something. Sit with what that means. The men hunting him were so far from him that they turned to a serial killer for directions. And the whole time, the answer, the man himself, was not a stranger to them. That is the part the public was never fully walked through. He was not a ghost the task force chased through fog and never glimpsed. He was a name in their files. He had been pulled in, questioned, looked at, logged. He drove a pickup truck through the corridor where the women vanished, an ordinary man in an ordinary vehicle, and at least once that ordinariness brushed directly against the investigation that was built to catch him. They had contact with him. They had him in a room. And he walked out. To understand how that happened, you have to understand the texture of the man they were looking at. Gary Leon Ridgway was not a recluse, not a drifter, not a figure who set off alarms by his strangeness. He held a steady job. For roughly 3 decades, he worked at a truck plant, painting trucks, showing up, clocking in, drawing a paycheck, the kind of employment record that reads in a file as the opposite of a red flag. He was married. He went to church. He talked about faith. To the people who shared a fence line with him, he was forgettable in the way that a quiet neighbor is forgettable, present, polite, unremarkable, the man whose name you would have to think for a second to recall. Coworkers would later describe a person so thoroughly average that his earlier brush with the investigation had become, of all things, a workplace joke. They ribbed him about having been questioned in the Green River case, the way coworkers rib a man about anything mildly notable. The killer they were hunting was so convincingly harmless that the people standing next to him every day treated his connection to the murders as comedy. That is the defining dread of this entire case. The monster was not hiding behind a monstrous face. He was indistinguishable from anyone else on the line. And in 1984, the gap between what he was and what he appeared to be was sealed shut by a single procedure. Ridgway was interviewed as a suspect. He was given a polygraph examination, and by the accounts that followed, he passed it. Sit with that, because it is one of the cruelest turns in the record. The man who would eventually be convicted of 49 murders sat down, was wired to a machine, was asked whether he was responsible, and the machine, or the people reading the machine, registered him as truthful. That result did not merely fail to catch him. It actively pushed the investigation away from him. It functioned as a kind of clearance, a reason to spend the limited hours and attention of the task force on other names, other trucks, other men. The polygraph did exactly the opposite of what everyone in that room hoped it would do. It pointed at the truth and called it a lie's absence. It is worth being plain about what experts in this field have held for a very long time, because the documentary owes you the limit as much as the drama. The polygraph is not a truth detector. It does not read the soul. It measures physiological responses, heart rate, breathing, skin conductivity, and infers deception from changes in those signals. And that inference is not reliable proof of anything. People who are lying can stay calm. People who are telling the truth can spike with anxiety. And some people whose internal weather does not move the way most people's does, can sit through the questions that should rattle anyone and produce a flat, clean line. The result here was, in the bluntest possible terms, a catastrophic false negative. A man who was killing women passed the test meant to flag exactly that. The machine did not lie to them on purpose. The machine simply could not do what they needed it to do, and the people relying on it could not see, in the moment, how badly it had failed them. The cost of that single misread is almost impossible to calculate because it is measured in the years that followed and the women who filled them. So here's the shape of the stalemate laid out cleanly. The task force was enormous. It had a suspect, this specific man, within its reach in the early to middle 1980s. It interviewed him, it collected from him, and then a flawed instrument and the limits of the era's science handed him a clean bill of suspicion, and the apparatus turned its enormous attention elsewhere. He was not a man who hid perfectly. He was a man the system repeatedly failed to convert from a name on a list into a defendant in a dock. The distance between those two things, between being looked at and being caught, is where 2 decades disappeared. And there is one more piece from those years sitting quietly in an evidence locker that turns the whole tragedy into something almost unbearable to contemplate. Because in 1987, 3 years after the polygraph that cleared him in practice, Gary Ridgway gave investigators something else. He gave them a sample. Voluntarily. He was still, on paper, a person of interest, still a name worth a second look, and in the course of that scrutiny he provided a swab of saliva. Biological material. His own cells, his own genetic signature, handed over and taken into custody and placed into storage. The answer to the question the entire task force existed to answer, who is the Green River Killer, was now physically inside a police facility, sealed and labeled and waiting. The man's identity was in their possession. They simply could not read it yet. The tools to make that sample speak did not exist in 1987, and so the swab sat there, usable but unreadable, a sealed envelope containing the name of the killer, in a building full of detectives who would have given anything to open it. They had it the whole time. They just couldn't open it. Sit with that for a moment, because it reframes everything. The 14 years between that swab and the arrest were not years in which the evidence was missing. The evidence was never missing. It was present, cataloged, preserved, and patiently waiting for the science to grow up around it. Detective Tom Jensen understood this in a way few others could afford to. As the task force shrank, as the funding thinned and the public moved on and the case slid from front-page urgency into the slow drawer of the unsolved, Jensen was, for long stretches, essentially the keeper of the file. He held the case through the lean years. He watched the field of DNA analysis evolve from a crude tool that needed large, fresh samples into something far more precise, and he waited, because he knew what was sitting in storage, and he knew what it could one day become. That day arrived in 2001. By then, a method called short tandem repeat analysis had matured enough to extract a usable genetic profile from old degraded biological material, the kind of sample that 14 years earlier could not have told anyone anything. The Washington State Patrol Crime Lab took the saliva sample given in 1987 and the biological evidence preserved from several of the victims, and they ran the comparison that the entire history of the case had been building toward. The profiles matched. The genetic material recovered from the bodies of Marcia Chapman, Opal Mills, and Carol Ann Christensen belonged to the man who had handed detectives his own saliva and walked back out into an ordinary life. It is worth stating plainly what closed this case, because it is not the story people expect. It was not a brilliant stakeout. It was not a confession wrung out in an interrogation room. It was not a tip from a frightened witness. It was a laboratory finally able to read a sentence that had been written down and locked away in 1987. The detective work had done its job long before. It had identified him, interviewed him, collected from him. What had been missing was never the man. What had been missing was the capability to confirm what the evidence already held. On November the 30th, 2001, Gary Leon Ridgway was arrested. By then, he was a long-employed truck painter, married, church-going, living a suburban life so unremarkable that it functioned as its own disguise. He had spent roughly 3 decades painting trucks at the same plant. Coworkers, when they learned of the arrest, recalled that they had once joked with him about having been questioned in the Green River case years earlier. They joked because the idea that quiet, average Gary could be that man was, to them, absurd. That is the defining dread of this entire story. The monster was not lurking in shadow. He was indistinguishable from the man beside you on the assembly line, the man in the next pew, the neighbor who waved from his driveway. In November of 2003, Ridgway pleaded guilty to 48 counts of aggravated first-degree murder. The plea spared him the death penalty, and in exchange he agreed to full cooperation, including leading investigators to remains that had never been found. That bargain was, and remains, controversial. Justice was weighed against recovery. Some believed a man who had taken so many lives should have faced the ultimate penalty. But for certain families, the deal was the only road that ended at a body, at a burial, at a place to grieve. Under the agreement, he walked detectives back into the woods he had used, and remains came home that otherwise never would have. A 49th conviction followed in 2011 for Rebecca Marrero. 49 murders are proven by his own guilty plea. He claimed more than that, more than he could be charged with, more than anyone could ever confirm, telling investigators he had killed so many women he could no longer keep them straight. Those additional claims remain unverified. Some of his victims may never be named. So in the end, the answer to the question, who was the Green River Killer, is not a mystery at all. It is settled. It has a name. But the harder truth is that the answer existed in usable form for 14 years before anyone could read it. The man was a suspect with a sample on file. What was absent was not a clue. It was the recognition, the urgency, and the technology to act on what the system already physically held. And underneath that sits the coldest fact of all. He chose his victims because he believed the world would not look hard for young women who lived along that highway. The runaways, the marginalized, the ones researchers grimly call the less dead. He bet that their deaths would not summon the full force of justice. For far too long, the institutions proved his bet correct. So let the last word belong to them, not to him. Wendy Coffield was 16. Opal Mills was 16. Many of the names on that list belong to children, daughters, sisters, girls who should have grown old. They were not a category. They were not disposable. They were the whole reason this story matters, and the reason it can never simply be filed away as solved. Here's what I want to ask you, and I genuinely want your answer below. If that 1987 sample had been treated with the urgency it deserved, if the science had been pushed, if the funding had been held, and if the suspect had never been let go, tell me where you land.